So I went forth and I created the files and, off I went to Puerto Rico. And the cans came off the press. The client is there. And no, sorry, it was a representative from the client was there. And they were wrong. They were just wrong.
All right. Are we good?
Let's do it.
All right, let's do it. Are you guys ready to rock?
Let's rock!
Today we're joined by Brandy Parker of Pearl Fisher, someone that I followed for a long time. She's spoken at the Dieline a million times. She's emceed it recently. And she is the head of realization at Pearl Fisher. Brandy, how's it going?
Hey, Evelio, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be on your podcast and excited to be here. So thanks for having me.
So anybody out there that's not familiar with Pearl Fisher, what are you guys known for?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So to give you sort of the brief history of Pearl Fisher, we were started in London about 27 years ago as a group, sort of as an organization. We're one of the only independently owned brand and design consultancies sort of left. So I think that's pretty significant. And we're most known for packaging design, though we do a lot of touch points in branding, whether it be identity. We're doing a whole lot more sort of extensions across the brand experience. You've probably heard a lot of agencies talking about sort of off-pack touch points and that kind of thing. So we're sort of really getting into that more and more lately. In terms of the actual work that we're known for, I would say some sort of the top 5 projects we're known for would be like Seedlip, the world's first non-alcoholic distilled spirit. We're known for a lot of own brand work. So we did a lot of work for Waitrose, kind of early days. We've done a lot of work for Target, Market Pantry, things like that. We recently just did a rebrand for ShopRite called Bowl and Basket, and that's been getting a lot of press for us lately. So yeah, food and beverage is pretty much the most ubiquitous thing sort of in our portfolio, but we're working a lot now with technology clients and personal care and cosmetics, and there's a lot that's going to be sort of coming up in the next year or so as we start to release those things. But I would say, we're well set up for packaging.
Being set up for packaging, do you have packaging engineers and industrial designers on your team?
We do have industrial designers on the team. And some of those guys have come in with, and I say guys because it's a largely male team. They've come in, some of them have come in with more engineering sort of backgrounds than others, but we don't really necessarily have strict engineers on the team. I would say, if anything, our realization team, of which I'm head of in New York, but extending across to London, San Francisco, and Copenhagen, there's kind of a mixture of backgrounds. So I would say a lot more of the realization people probably have more engineering type background where they understand performance of materials and things like that.
That's one of the things that's always stuck out to me when I've spoken to you is this head of realization. It's a title that completely explains what it is that you do. Making all these projects come to life, having all these designs actually be realized. Can you tell me a little bit about that team and how you've grown this department?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that attracted me to Pearl Fisher, because I was a fan of Pearl Fisher for probably 10 years before I ever joined. And I would say in some cases, I was slowly making my pathway toward Pearl Fisher. And I think one of the main things that attracted me was that they had not only bothered to elevate the discipline of production, but they had this very cool name for it. So I had this idea that, oh my gosh, if that title must be such a discussion point. And actually it is with a lot of our clients. What is that? Is that what I think it is? And like you said, it kind of describes what it does. And I think it really does. But it's always like, ooh, that's such a cool title. So, I mean, that's one thing that's going for us, because I think, otherwise being production director or, head of production or whatever, it's one of those terms. Production is one of those terms that gets lost in a sea of other things that qualify as being production. Um, and I wouldn't go so far to say as it's generic, but I would say realization helps elevate it. Um, in terms of starting the department and growing it, when I came on board in New York, I was a team of one. And in the early days of New York, we were also a small studio of about 15 people. And I've been there almost 7 years now, and over time have been able to grow the team up to three, which doesn't sound that big, but I think for a lot of our compadres at these other agencies, having production team at all, much less having more than a couple of people, is a pretty significant thing. So, pulling in people, even in New York, production is one of those skill sets that is almost fallen out of fashion in this weird way. So it's hard to find young people. It's hard to find junior and mid-level people to come in and bring onto the team. I've managed to do so, but it's very difficult to find. There's a lot of senior people out there, and quite a lot of them are freelance. So I get the benefit of having seniors on my team, as well as being able to bring in freelance seniors ad hoc. But it's a real mixture of people with backgrounds in strict artworking in terms of packaging. I've got typography and typesetting experts. I've got people that come from the corporate identity background. I even had a guy that was a professional sort of high-end retoucher for 10 years before he joined my team. So there's like this series of winding roads and backgrounds that really make what I like to call the multicolored tapestry of the realization team, full of variety, full of depth of skills. And I would say the same thing for the London team. Although I think in the UK, there's much more of an infrastructure set up for people to apprentice and go through this kind of artworking, learning on the job situation than there is in the US. But yeah, there's a good diversity of people across the teams in all four studios.
Production's not something that people really talk about. It's always the accolades go to the design, but in order to accomplish those designs, you have to be able to make it happen. So with your team, how involved do you get at the beginning of each project?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something that I, over time, sort of working at different agencies, have gotten really interested in is workflow, systems design. Mm-hmm. And it's something I never could have told you as an art major coming out of university that I would ever give a crap about. But systems design and therefore workflow design has become one of those things that actually shapes everything about what we do and how we do it. So you ask about us being involved at the beginning, that's just it. We are. And I would say that is what's missing from so many other people's workflows. It makes sense because what realization production are coming to the project with is creative problem solving from a completely different angle. To give you an example, I was on an immersion with a new client doing some sustainable farming of a product I can't really talk about. But what I was able to interject at that moment of immersion, before we ever put pencil to page in design, was, what I think would be great for this is an algae-based ink, and I know this vendor that's making it, and let's make sure that when we get to that stage where we're printing stationery, we're printing packaging, that we use that ink. And they were so on board, and it shaped the way we design, and it shaped the way that, frankly, it's going to come out. And that's only something I feel, in this case, would have come from realization. So it's finding those opportunities. It's not just for us to take on and understand the technical parameters. Like, do we know that they're only willing to print flexo? Do we know that they're only doing dry offset and the substrates? Or do we have opportunity to change that or push that? And the other benefit of us being sort of involved at the beginning is we can use that entirety of the timeline. Because you and I both know, and I'm sure you've experienced this in things you've been involved in, design gets, the biggest slice of the pie, right? And rightly so, to develop the ideas and get them. But then production, or realization in this case, might have 2 or 3 days to artwork files and get them out. And if you're looking at a traditional workflow, there's no way you could innovate in that timeline. 2 to 3 days, crossing our fingers, hoping we can toss it over the wall and it'll come out right, is no way to work. But the truth is that the time that the client says, I'm approving this design, and when they expect it to go to print is this very short timeline. So while we know we cannot change that, what we can change is how we work. So by being involved at the beginning, we get that benefit of parallel pathing with design. And maybe I'm on the phone with the printers while the designers are actually still in explore phase. And I'm saying, hey, printer X, I'm seeing the designers kind of doing this kind of thing in their concept. Is that something you've ever done? Have you ever done a double foil stamp? Have you ever done an overprint on a foil? You know, things like that. And we start having that conversation before we're even looking at visuals. And then if they say no, then maybe I'm on the hunt for a print vendor that I know or have worked with before that I know could do it. And I present that at the time we present the concept. So it's a lot of things, right? Being involved and being immersed in the project as much as the designers means that we can add as much value as we're allowed to. So whether that's understanding the technical parameters, pushing them, finding innovations, interjecting new vendors, building timelines to accommodate maybe something new that we're trying, or frankly, just pushing the design and doing the due diligence to understand whether it can be produced or not. Because one of the things we pride ourselves in is at the very beginning, we're not going to present to you any designs that we don't know can be done. And if for some reason at that moment, if we don't know, we'll tell the client, hey, we're pushing it a little far on this concept. We're not sure if it could be done, but give us some time. We know what we need to ask and who we need to ask. We'll get back to you. And transparency like that is always better.
Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by pushing the design from a production standpoint?
Sure. You know, I think what is missing from design education today, and I've seen it because I've been an adjunct instructor myself, is designers, you know, they're being taught the fundamentals of design, composition, color, type, all that good stuff, which is very important. But few of them are being taught how ink actually works, how it interacts with substrate, how different press types work, and how that affects what you can do with your design. So if we want to push to the design, right, then we want to understand better how it will be produced so we know what our levers are. So, for example, if I know we're going to be doing a design for a beverage and it's going to be on an aluminum can, then what I can tell that designer is it's going to be dry offset and it's going to be a maximum of 6 colors. There's no moving that. The only thing that moves that is if the client can't pay for all 6 colors.
And do lots of gradients.
Right. No gradients, color sets, all that good stuff, right? But if a designer that doesn't understand that starts designing and they put a bunch of gradients and a bunch of photography, then they're going to end up having to dumb down the design at a really inopportune moment and have something that comes out that is not anything like they wanted or expected. Whereas if we build that into the process and the problem solving, then we can push the design to the strength of the medium, meaning that we can design to the problem we're solving very specifically and make it the best it can be on that substrate in that scenario. I would say another way that, you know, designers that understand production can push design is also knowing what sort of crayons they have in the box, meaning they know that, yeah, I can hot stamp or I can cold stamp. Here's the difference, and here's the benefit in the sort of the benefit of both. You know, or, oh, this doesn't have to be a board. I can make it, you know, a flexible stand-up pouch, or, you know, any number of things. I think it's all about knowing what tools you have in your arsenal and what crayons you have in your sort of stack, if you will, in your box of crayons. Because I don't think you can really push the envelope if you don't understand the envelope.
Is it merely experience that allows you then to understand that envelope?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I would say largely yes. I think experience is so much of that. But I think it's also mentors. You know, young designers that come into agencies that get mentored right away, whether by senior designers, knowledgeable, design directors, ACDs, etc., into production. So production folks on the team that aren't just, miserable, grumpy people sitting in the back of the room saying no to everything. If there's someone on that team that's willing to mentor the young designers to bring them up into their sort of world, I think that's a huge, powerful thing too. The designers I've spoken to, the designers I've taught, um, some of them have taken me up on being interns. So I've actually had the privilege of having some realization interns come in. So, people fresh out of design school wanting to kind of try it out. Um, I've also recommended that some designers go and do an apprenticeship program at a local print shop, or, similar experience where maybe they're doing a summer job at a print shop or something like that. There's no better way to understand the sort of behind the scenes nuts and bolts of a process than actually seeing it in action.
It's just really important to just open up that opportunity for young designers, or even mid-level designers that are interested in making a shift. I personally spent a few years working at a printer early on.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the owner of the print shop was like, you can make a career just by understanding paper.
Oh yeah.
It's like, and it was the same thing with ink, and it's like all these different things you can niche down so far within all the different processes within production. But it's incredible. So it just makes you a stronger designer that way.
You know what? You bring up a really good point, which is the paper bit, and that reminds me that part of what's helped me learn in my job too is having fantastic representatives from these different companies. So whether it's a paper company, whether it's an ink company, I have all kinds of people calling on me now because I'm relatively well known at this point. So people, vendors call me and pitch stuff. But at first, it was almost like I was cold calling vendors and being like, okay, if I had this uncoated paper, how would that soak up the ink compared to this other thing? And how can you tell me more about the performance on an offset press, that kind of stuff? And having reps willing to sit down with you and actually talk you through a project or talk through stuff like that has been a tremendous help to me and young designers. So I would encourage, all the young designers out there to make friends with your paper reps, make friends with your press and print partners, because they're actually willing to tell you a lot. It just makes their job easier.
No, that's a great point. And a lot of the, whether it's pressmen or bindery people, I mean, they've got so much experience doing what they're doing that they have so much to share. On the material side, so even just digging further in on the paper, have there been projects that you've worked on where maybe you've had to develop a custom paper or a custom pulp?
Yeah, we have come so close so many times. I think the biggest barrier to actually doing it comes down to cost and volume.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these paper companies are making it sort of more approachable to be able to get something custom through the mill. But the reality is you've got to get pallets of paper to make that work. I would say the closest is when we were working on some whiskey labels for a brand, and we had this brilliant idea to use some of the brewing waste or the distilling waste as part of the paper, and it was going to work. They tested it, but it really just came down to volume, and we just couldn't hit that volume. So it's one of those things that I think people should always be striving for, because I think paper in some cases, especially with labeling, is like the last thing designers think about. I'm not speaking for Pearl Fisher here because I think we're really good at considering all that all the time. But a lot of other agencies that are maybe focused on graphics primarily, and whatever, that's their strength and that's great. It's not a bad thing. Paper kind of comes last as a consideration. I think it's such a good way to create something ownable for a brand. So if you can meet the minimums and meet the volume, I think it's definitely a cool thing to do.
some of the spirits packaging that you guys have worked on, some of the glass bottles. How involved are you in the production on some of those things?
Oh
Because
yeah.
we've talked about paper, and you've got paper nailed down, and plastics as well, and then we're talking about glass. So you have all these different materials
Yeah.
that seem to be all in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, that's been the wonderful thing about being in this industry and why I'm still so psyched about this job so many years later, um, is all of the materials, all the press types, all of the variables that we get to work with on a day-to-day basis. It's not just the variety of projects, it's the variety of outputs, right? Um, so glass, that's a big one that early on in my career I got very interested in. And frankly, I think I could have done my entire career without knowing anything about glass because I think the expectation is quite low for the agency to know much. But my own personal interest and curiosity is led me to get really involved. So the way it works with us is a lot like the graphics workflow. So if we're doing a structural design, then I'm connecting with the structural team in the same way that I'm connecting with the graphics team. Like, okay, here are our technical parameters. This is the kind of line it's going to go on. It's a high-speed line with fully automatic application. Here are the limitations of designing the bottle. Here are the sort of the pros and the cons, if you will. Whether something's being applied automatically or manually, and I'm talking about the labels here, that actually greatly affects how you're going to design that glass. And a lot of people may not think about that, but asking crucial questions at the beginning of a project, like, let me see your line. If I can't see it because of COVID, then tell me about it. Are you putting anything on there by hand? Are you doing it all automatically? Because then that dictates a lot. And then just knowing the limitations of glass, like what kind of angles you can put in glass, what kind of radii you need to allow for on the corners, fill lines, stuff like that, is things that I need to be in the know so that I can guide the team. And like I said, a lot of our structural designers are so talented. They know, they come with a lot of that knowledge. So it's less about me guiding that way and more about guiding them in the way that it will all be put together in the end. So yeah, so I kind of work alongside them the way I work alongside the graphics team. So, I'm checking in with the glass manufacturer. We're doing sort of over the shoulder kind of reviews of concepts. We're verifying as we go. And then when it's time to send them the preliminary CAD so they can engineer it and send it back to us, then I'm very involved in that file transfer and that effort. And I'm reading the blueprints and I'm sort of feeding back to the teams. So realization gets to be as pretty much as involved as we want to, but it's one of the things that I love most about the job is getting to do that stuff.
Is that part of that early sleuthing, for example, where you're talking to the production line, what kind of lines are they running, what kind of labels, what kind of adhesives, and you're pulling all that information together and providing that early on pre-concept?
Yeah.
Or
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, if we can get all that information before we start concepting, which is ideal, then I'm able to sort of compile it into what we call a technical brief for the team. And I create technical briefs both for structure teams and for the graphics teams. And if we have all the information together, I'll create one technical brief that covers all of it. And so that the team kind of has this very clear idea of where they're headed from the very beginning. And, I try not to treat a technical brief like, here's all your parameters, here's basically where you can't go. It's more like we treat limitations as opportunities. And again, how do we design against some of these limitations and bring forth the best expression of a thing, sort of the best version of itself in the medium and in the given materials that we're working with. And over time, I've been able to bring the design teams along with me on that. Because at first, I think working a different way, because what I've done is I've brought in this workflow, right, to this team. And there was, designers already there. So kind of getting them on the same page as me, but also seeing over time, bringing them on that journey, seeing how it actually means that they get off the press or off the line in the case of glass, exactly what they expected, has encouraged them to sort of come along with me and see, like, okay, there is method to the madness, and it's not just about saying what we can and can't do.
I can definitely appreciate that. I think what's most exciting for me has been just setting parameters, and really tight parameters on what is and what isn't possible, and then just pulling out all the stops within that.
Yeah.
You can be a lot more creative once you've got.
Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise, yeah, you don't know where to stop.
Yeah, yeah, and the way I put it to my students when I'm teaching them is, have you ever been given a brief that was basically a blank slate? And if so, how did your sort of concepting and process differ than when you were given at least one or two bits of guidance or restrictions? And unanimously, inevitably, all of the students say, actually, yeah, given a few limitations, it's easier. It's easier to get started. A blank slate is almost paralyzing. So I like to think that a tech brief serves the same purpose.
I know early on in my career, even just when I was working at that printer, cutting paper, learning about fiber direction, learning about grain direction, I had a palette of paper to cut, and the top sheet was in the wrong orientation, and I cut the whole stack.
Oh.
Everything got printed, went through the bindery, every single fold cracked, and it was my fault. The owner of the print shop, this was like 20 years ago. The owner of the print shop's like, all right, you've got to deliver that. You've got to deliver that project and explain to them what happened. And it's a lesson I'll never forget. I know early on, just we talk about experience and everything on the production side, but what are those lessons that those hard-earned lessons that you'll never forget?
Oh man, you know what? I really love this question, because it exposes all of us as human, doesn't it? But what I think is great about those experiences, like you're saying, which is, that hurts me to think about, is that it's true, you never forget. Like, that is something you will never forget in the rest of your career. So I guess for me, a lot of those big bloopers came as I started off, because that's when you make those mistakes, right? And I would say the most significant one is a can printing incident. It's why I talk about aluminum can printing a lot, because it's so scarred in my brain. So the story goes that I was working at the first agency I was working for shortly after I moved to New York, which would have been the early 2000s. And first packaging agency, I should qualify. So I was working for the first packaging agency, and I was doing really well. I was a junior production artist, and things were going along pretty well. I had an awesome boss, and she was like, "Hey, I have an opportunity to send you to Puerto Rico for a press run for this can project we were working on." It was a big redesign for a beer based in the Caribbean. So I was like, "Oh yeah, awesome! I'm ready to go." And she's like, "Okay, well, make sure you ask all your questions, you get everything before you go. As you're making the files, make sure you understand everything that's going on. Here's some things to remember, et cetera, et cetera." So I went forth and I created the files, and off I went to Puerto Rico. And the cans came off the press. The client is there. And no, sorry, it was a representative from the client was there. And they were wrong. They were just wrong. Now, nothing was wrong with the copy. Nothing was wrong with sort of the positioning of things, because all of that had been proofed and approved. But the colors were wrong. And one of the biggest mistakes I made was assuming that the colors could touch, that you could overprint silver and get things. So, like, for example, we had done metallicized paper labels where we had overprinted this light orange to create a gold color on the bottle labels. So I had just simply translated that technique over into the cans. Well, what I got was bright orange where there should be gold. And the problem is that color was being used across many elements doing different jobs. So in some areas it was creating a gold, and in some areas it was meant to stay orange and create a kind of warmth around the artwork. So we got this bright orange can, and it was a disaster. And I was like, oh my God. And there was a language barrier. A lot of the pressmen were really amazing, but I didn't speak great Spanish and they didn't speak great English. So we had a little bit of an issue. And I had to think on my feet. And this was a production run. This wasn't a print test. This was a production run. So they're just cranking, and the client rep doesn't know anything about printing. They're like, oh my God, it's orange. Like, what are we going to do? So I had to call the client. Well, first I call my boss and I'm freaking out. And she's like, calm down. Like, you got this, call them and talk through some of the options that you see as solutions. So I was like, okay. So I call the client and I'm like, all right, we can replace the color with a gold, but then some of the areas of the artwork that are supposed to look orange are going to be gold. If we keep it orange, it's going to be bright orange. So that's not going to work. So we have this conversation with the client, and finally it became pretty clear that we needed to stop the press run because the artwork just wasn't going to work with a sort of an ad hoc solution, and they couldn't reburn plates there or anything. So I had to make this crazy decision to pull the run, and then they had to basically reschedule it, and I had to have time to fly back to New York, correct the artwork, and resubmit it. So it was a big, mess up, as you would say. And I learned so much from that, because what I hadn't done is asked all the right questions. What I hadn't done, and clearly the client needed a lot of hand-holding and was relying on the agency to sort of guide them through the process. So we could have done things like demand drawdowns, for example, which we would have seen the orange would have been wrong before we ever got to the press run. And, just level setting, maybe even with the wet proof or something like this. So yeah, I learned a lot from that run. And thankfully the client didn't fire us, but they weren't very happy.
That's the lesson, I think, for designers looking to get into production or working with production is, when you're starting out, you're going to screw up. Right? We all do. It's just, what do you learn from that?
Exactly.
And when you're working with an experienced, whether it's your pressman or, whoever it is down the line in your production, when they tell you, you need to ask these questions, or they tell you this is not possible for these reasons, it's because of that experience. So that's why it's so important, I think, to stay connected with everybody in that line.
You're totally right. And it's such an important thing to know. When I tell my students, when I tell, the young juniors that come in, I tell them that exact thing. I say, look, you are going to make a big mistake. So just be okay with that now. But the most important thing is that you learn something from it and don't do it twice. Like, it's all good for people on my team to make mistakes. It happens. We're human. It's fine. But what I don't want to see is the same mistake twice, because that means you're not learning. So it's kind of this acceptance, like, okay, I am going to mess up at some point, but also knowing, there's benefit of that in that.
Being on the production side, on the realization side, working with all the different partners and being so involved in the manufacturing, does that lend itself to allowing you to introduce more sustainable options to clients, and just because of the research that you're doing?
Yeah. I mean, I kind of almost insert myself into it, right? Because I'm so greedy for the knowledge at the beginning. It positions me in such a way that I can come back and go, okay, well, have we thought about switching your label paper to this? And so, yeah, it thrills me to be able to kind of ask about sustainability, or at least push options. Because the thing is that, especially in the United States, a big percentage of the time, if you ask a marketing person, where is sustainability on your list of priorities? They'll tell you it's pretty high. But then when you get to, it's always top three. But when you get to the end of the project, cash is king, and they don't want to spend that extra cash. So it suddenly falls off the priority list altogether. So the best thing is to try to integrate the idea of it as soon in the process as possible, so that it becomes almost part of the canon, part of the lexicon of the project, so that by the time you get to the end, if it's going to cost more, hopefully all of the stakeholders have bought in so much to what you're doing with that sustainable material that it becomes a non-issue. But I would love to tell you that I'm successful most of the time, but I'm not. Sustainability is still a very difficult thing to work in. And I would say even harder in these times of COVID and the pandemic. People are really just trying to keep status quo, and I get it. But we really, as an industry, do have to start making those sacrifices and pushing sustainability wherever we can, and then that includes from the client side too.
But what do you see happening after COVID? What's the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that health and sanitation are going to be more top of mind for people as a part of the sustainability equation, where it hasn't been before. So I would say existing in this pandemic has forced us to realize that health of humans and planet are pretty high up in the sustainability sort of consideration set. So I think that will change the way we look at packaging for sure. And the crisis around plastics is such a difficult one. The thing is that there's so many reasons why we can't live with it and can't live without it right now. And so for me, it's keeping tabs on the scientists and universities that are developing technologies that are pushing us either beyond plastics or with dealing with plastics in a better way. Because we're not technologically there yet to be able to either do with them or do without them, if that makes sense. Yeah. I also think that the future of packaging doesn't hinge on a broken recycling system. I think that there's been a couple of really great articles recently on Fastco. This author, Don Norman, has been writing a lot about the complexity of recycling, and he's a systems expert, which is fascinating. And he's done a 2-part series on both the problems with recycling and also maybe some ideas on how we might go about starting to fix it. And that's a big one for me, because there's a lot of organizations, there's a lot of even some of our clients that are putting all their eggs, their sustainability eggs, in the recycling basket. And I think that there's just a lot of reasons why that's maybe not the right answer for the future. The way that we've sort of written our own manifesto of sustainability, we've called it lightweighting. And the way that we're looking at solutions there is, on either end of a spectrum, can we work with and produce materials that degrade on their own? So whether that's through biodegradability, compostability, etc., or on the other end of the spectrum, materials that are actually designed to stick around, designed to be reused, designed to be durable and last a lifetime or more. And actually, where in that spectrum, can we put our solutions? And I would argue that while recyclability and recycling can fit on that spectrum, it is only one sort of shade of color against all these other shade of colors of possibilities with solutions that don't necessarily rely on it. Because it is a broken system. I mean, there's news. I read an article just the other day about the UK. They're discontinuing recycling a lot of different materials because of the market values is plummeted. The thing just happened in California, I guess probably 6 months ago, where a whole chain of recycling centers closed because of mismanagement of funds. The basis of the system is a privately owned capitalistic system, which, if you ask me, recycling it really should be a nonprofit, sort of government-run system to both keep the standards and also make sure that things aren't just being recycled or not based on its current market value, that it's all about the interest of the health of the planet. But obviously that's Like that's super optimistic and that's very like utopian. And I know how unrealistic that is. So that's what pushes me to try to find solutions beyond recycling. And I think TerraCycle, you just spoke to Suzaki the other day, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
he's been doing an amazing, job with starting in recycling and recycling unrecyclable materials, which is so cool, to Loop, which is all about reuse and what I've been talking about, that durability of goods. Because there are solutions outside of the recycling system, because he knows that it's broken. That's what he's been trying to fix.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the future of sustainability depends on other solutions.
Just having, as we're kind of wrapping up here, but just having done this podcast for a little bit now, I spoke to this gentleman, Bo Peck, who's in Salt Lake. He's a recycler there, and they do a closed lid system. And when I design something, I always design it for the recycling system
Right.
that I know. But speaking to Bo in Salt Lake, he works with a lot of small rural areas, and people actually will wash their recyclables. They will, separate them, and then they will drive them to a recycling center. And he's like, this is the way a lot of recycling happens. And, by doing it this way, people are more conscious of what they're recycling, because they're going to wash it and they don't want to drive it. So people are really paying attention to that. And it was a system, to be honest, I wasn't familiar with. So as a designer, one of the things that Tom did say was, when you're doing research for sustainability, it's like, just call a lot of recycling centers in just different areas, because your product's going to be sold everywhere, and you don't know where it's going to end up being recycled. Just because I got curbside doesn't mean I design.
Yeah, and that's such an important point, right? And why it's so difficult to design for it, because there are so many different systems and different standards. Yeah, I mean, I'm in South Arkansas right now. I normally obviously live in New York, but this little community here has the same system. My parents have been avid recyclers since I was in high school, and they drive, once my dad's pickup truck gets filled up, they drive it to the local center. And back in the day, the motivation was that the recycling center sort of attendant would be able to hand you cash in hand based on the weight of the stuff that you brought in. That is, of course, not the case anymore. That went away a long time ago, so people just drop it off in good faith. But it's fascinating to me that people are still motivated to get in the car and drive it. That's pretty phenomenal.
Brandy, I want to thank you so much for spending all this time with me, talking about everything from realization, production, manufacturing, and sustainability. What's the best place for people to connect with you?
Well, yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I've really enjoyed it. Talking about, I could just wonk on all day about all these things. So thanks for giving me the platform to do it. In terms of the best place to get me, probably right now the best place to get me is LinkedIn. So you can just search Brandy, Brandi, Parker, and Pearl Fisher.
I'll have links.
There you go.
Links
even easier. So that's probably the best place, and I'm always happy to help out a student or somebody just entering the industry. So yeah, please reach out, ask questions. That'd be great.
Awesome. Will do. Once again,
thank you, man.
Brandy,
have a great rest of your day.